Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The year 1944 was one of the most difficult periods for Japan during the Pacific War. The Japanese Imperial Army, which had resisted with great determination throughout World War II, had now been forced into a defensive stance, losing its territories to the rapidly advancing American forces. One of Japan's key bases in the Pacific, Guam Island, was a focal point of the war's intensity. The U.S. aimed to capture the island to weaken Japan's defensive lines and open the route to the Japanese mainland. Shoichi Yokoi was born in 1915 in Aichi Prefecture, Japan, into a modest family of tailors. However, from a young age, he embraced military discipline and enlisted in the Japanese Imperial Army, eventually serving as a sergeant. In 1943, he was sent to Guam to support Japan's presence in the Pacific. He and other soldiers were tasked with defending the island against an American invasion. However, things did not go as expected. On July 21, 1944, the U.S. launched a major attack on Guam. After days of heavy bombardment by the U.S. Navy, American forces landed on the island with thousands of soldiers. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the Japanese fought with determination. But the balance of the battle quickly shifted in favor of the Americans. With their powerful weapons and tanks, the U.S. forces swiftly captured the coastal areas, and the Japanese defenses were shattered. Thousands of soldiers were killed in the process. Shoichi Yokoi and many of the other Japanese soldiers were forced to retreat deeper into the island's interior. According to Japan's military doctrine, it was considered a great shame for a soldier to be captured. For them, it was more honorable to die than to surrender. As a result, the surviving soldiers hid in the dense forests of the island to avoid capture. The forests Yokoi fled to were dense with vegetation and rugged terrain. He and other Japanese deserters began to hide and survive in the jungle. But as the days passed, conditions became increasingly difficult. The scattered groups of soldiers suffered from hunger and dehydration. When American forces took full control of the island, the remaining Japanese soldiers had become fugitives. At first, Yokoi and a few soldiers tried to survive by hiding and hunting small animals. However, over time, those in his group died from disease or hunger. Some were captured by enemy forces or surrendered. Yokoi, however, managed to escape and moved deeper into the island's more isolated areas. Soon, he was completely alone. Believing the war was still ongoing, Shoichi Yokoi had to learn to survive in the jungle. He only had a few basic items and his uniform. There was no food or shelter suitable for survival. Undeterred, he moved cautiously to avoid detection by the enemy. First, he built a simple shelter, and then he began to struggle against nature in search of food. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. However, he had no idea when the war would end. Without a radio or access to newspapers, he had no way of knowing whether Japan had surrendered. He continued to survive, utilizing every resource the jungle provided, living in complete isolation for years. When Shoichi Yokoi fled into the forests of Guam, the horrors of the war were still fresh in his mind. While Japanese soldiers were falling on the battlefield, his only option for survival was to hide. But as he soon realized, this was not just about hiding from the enemy. He had to battle hunger, thirst, disease, and the harsh conditions of nature. In the early days, Yokoi survived by relying on his instincts. He had only his old rifle, a few personal items, and the uniform on his back. However, using the rifle would have given away his position, so he planned to use it only in case of immediate threat. Hunger soon became an overwhelming issue. Finding food in the jungle was no easy task. Initially, he tried to gather fruits and roots that fell from the trees. But knowing that many plants could be poisonous, he dared to eat only the ones he recognized. As time passed, he became more familiar with the natural resources available. The wild jungle of Guam provided plenty of taro roots, wild bananas, and sour sweet guava, which became his primary sources of food. However, relying solely on plants was not enough for long-term survival. He realized that he needed to hunt small animals. Using his bare hands, he began to catch crabs and small rodents. Later, he learned to make simple traps using tree branches and vines. With these traps, he was able to catch rats, snakes, and sometimes small birds. However, feeding himself was only part of survival. During the first nights without shelter, the humid and cold air of the forest posed a great threat to him. While he roasted under the hot sun during the day, at night, he shivered from the cold that settled into the forest. Moreover, the mosquitoes, abundant in tropical regions, caused him sleepless nights. At first, he made a simple shelter by stacking large leaves on top of each other. But this wasn't enough. In order to hide from the enemy and protect himself, he needed a more secure refuge. Yokoi realized that surviving in the forest was a long-term struggle. Simply hiding wouldn't save him. He needed to integrate with nature and fully adapt. Therefore, he decided to build a shelter. First, he chose a location with dense trees. He thought that digging an underground shelter would be safer. Digging by hand was difficult, but with a primitive shovel made from bamboo branches, he began to dig into the soil. After days of effort, he dug a small hole and started sleeping in it. However, this hole couldn't protect him from the rain or wild animals. So he continued to improve his shelter. Using bamboo stems and palm leaves, he camouflaged the entrance. To prevent water from seeping in, he created a roof by stacking large leaves on top. He covered the entrance with vines to make it harder to detect. Now he was better protected from the rain and predators. At night, he silently hid, and during the day he moved around to gather food and materials. To avoid being spotted by American soldiers or local people, he constantly made sure to leave no traces behind. To cover his footprints, he walked along rivers and regularly cleaned the area around his camp, eliminating any signs that could reveal his presence. Days, weeks, and months passed, and Yokoi gradually learned how to live in the forest. He was no longer just a man hiding. He had become someone who seized every opportunity nature offered to survive. He didn't know how long he would remain in the forest, but with each passing day, he became more skilled, blending in as part of nature. Still, his greatest enemy was loneliness. Shoichi Yokoi realized that surviving in the forest was not a one-day or few-week effort. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, he had to accept that he would be living there for a long time. At first, he managed with temporary solutions. He had built a makeshift shelter from leaves and fed himself whenever he found food. However, to survive longer in the forest, he realized he needed to establish a permanent system. The first step in this was to build a safe shelter. He had experienced how dangerous the forest could be once night fell. Being caught in tropical storms, wild animals roaming in the night's silence, or even a rat stealing his food were major issues for him. Now, he needed to build a well-hidden shelter, not only for protection from nature but also to erase all traces of his presence. He found a soft, earth-filled area deeper in the forest that seemed suitable for building a shelter. Digging by hand would be quite difficult, so he made a digging tool from bamboo stems with a sharp point. After days of effort, he slowly dug the soil and created a narrow entrance tunnel. As he progressed, he began to expand his cave. He camouflaged the shelter so that it would be undetectable from the outside, using leaves and branches. As the days passed, he placed a bamboo bed platform inside the cave. The soil floor was damp, and sleeping directly on the ground was both unhealthy and uncomfortable. By laying palm leaves over the bamboo platform, he created a more comfortable area. However, building a shelter was not enough. To survive, he needed to be regularly fed. Initially, he had managed with the fruits, roots, and small animals he found. But to live long-term in the forest, he needed to establish a more systematic food source. So he began hunting and setting traps. Yokoi's greatest advantage was the basic survival training he had received from the Japanese army. He learned to make spring traps from bamboo to catch small animals. He made traps using stakes and thin vines to catch rodents. Additionally, when he went to the riverbanks, he built small dams with stones to trap fish, allowing him to catch them. One of his greatest successes was catching a snake. Many snakes lived in Guam's tropical forests, some of which were venomous. However, he had learned to identify the non-venomous ones. He would cook the snakes he caught over fire and keep their skins for various needs. As time passed, his struggle with nature turned into a way of life. He was no longer a defenseless soldier in the wild. He had become a survival expert who took advantage of every opportunity nature offered. But still, no hunt or shelter could protect him from his greatest enemy, loneliness. At first, he had hoped that one of the other Japanese soldiers would come and find him, but as time passed, this hope dwindled. He heard no human voices around him, and he had no news about the outcome of the war. He didn't even know if Japan was still fighting. Maybe everyone was dead. Perhaps Japan had fallen. In this uncertainty, he tried to forget his loneliness by repeating the same routine every day. In the mornings, he searched for food. In the afternoons, he worked on improving his shelter, and in the evenings he silently sat in his cave. As the years passed, his longing for human voices grew. Sometimes, when a shadow moved, he thought he had seen one of his old friends. At times, the sounds made by the wind seemed like someone speaking, but no one was there. Nature had become both his home and his prison. Shoichi Yokoi was no longer just a fugitive soldier. He had become a man fighting against nature, but his greatest battle would be against his own mind. At first, Shoichi Yokoi hadn't noticed how time passed. His daily struggle for survival kept him busy, searching for food, checking his traps, repairing his shelter, and protecting himself from animals at night. But as time went on, he realized that in addition to the physical survival challenges, he was facing a completely different enemy: loneliness. In the beginning, he still held on to hope. He believed that the Japanese army would find him and that the course of the war would change. Perhaps one day friendly forces would come, retake Guam, and send him back to the front lines. But months passed, then years. No Japanese soldiers came, nor did he hear any news of how the war was progressing. The uncertainty he found himself in began to wear him down more with each passing day. He didn't know if the war was over. If Japan had lost, surrendering would be a great shame for him. But if Japan had won, why had no one come to rescue him? As these questions gnawed at his mind, the only thing he could do was stick to his routine in order to survive. To forget his loneliness, he created a strict daily schedule for himself. He would wake up early in the morning to search for food, check his shelter and traps during the afternoons, and in the evenings he would prepare the food he had found and retreat to his cave. This routine gave him a sense of purpose. If he couldn't find anything to do during the day, his mind would begin to play tricks on him. Sometimes he found himself thinking about the past. He remembered his home in Japan, his family, and his childhood memories. He once had a normal life, a warm meal, moments spent talking with friends, days walking in crowded streets. Now all he had around him was the silence of the wild. As time passed, keeping his sanity became his greatest struggle. Sometimes he thought he heard a sound, or when a shadow moved, he imagined it was a person. At night, the howls of the wind reminded him of the calls of Japanese soldiers. But these were just tricks his mind was playing on him. He developed various methods to ease his loneliness. He began to talk to himself. He would tell the stones and bamboo, which he thought of as his journal, about what he had been through. Sometimes he would hold a branch like a weapon and create imaginary battle scenarios with enemies. By recalling his past, he would revisit his memories over and over, reliving them in his mind. This was the way he found to avoid going mad. However, at times despair would descend on him like a heavy shadow. Would no one ever find him? Could Japan really have lost? If so, what was the point of hiding in the forest? He began asking himself these questions. Sometimes he would curl up in his cave and wait for hours doing nothing. Despite all the loneliness and uncertainty, Yokoi still believed the war was ongoing. According to Japanese military teachings, surrendering was not an option. Becoming a prisoner was shameful, and death was considered more honorable. For this reason, each passing year he became even more hidden. He did everything he could to hide. He was careful not to leave footprints around his camp. He didn't make fires because he knew the smoke would give away his position. He didn't spend too much time near the river as he didn't want to leave traces on the banks. To avoid being noticed by American soldiers or locals, he was always cautious. Especially in the last years, he had observed people moving around the area from a distance. Sometimes he saw American soldiers, sometimes the native people of Guam. However, he never approached them and always watched from afar, never revealing his presence, because if he were caught, he could die without ever believing that the war had ended. Yokoi had lived alone in the forest for years. Loneliness had psychologically strained him, but it had also forced him to think with discipline. To maintain his mental balance, he adhered to small routines and survival techniques. For him, the concept of time had long since disappeared. He didn't know what day of the year it was. He couldn't even properly calculate how many years had passed. The only thing he knew was that he had to hide for Japan's honor. Until one day, this 27-year-long loneliness would come to an end. It was January 1972. For Shoichi Yokoi, it was just another day like the others. As usual, he woke up early in the morning and left his cave to search for food. Every sound and movement in nature was important to him, as one of the most crucial survival rules for the past years was to remain unnoticed. But what he didn't realize was that this day would mark the end of his 27 years of loneliness. That day, two natives of Guam, Jesus Duenas and Manuel de Gracia, were fishing along the riverbank. The people of Guam were familiar with the area because they often roamed the forest to hunt. However, on that day they saw an unusual movement in the forest. A bush had suddenly rustled, and then a shadow quickly disappeared. Under normal circumstances, they might have thought it was a wild animal, but this movement was unusually cautious and seemed aimed at hiding. Driven by curiosity, the hunters carefully approached the direction of the bush. They raised their torches and examined the dark areas. Finally, they saw the silhouette of a man. His clothes were torn, his hair and beard were tangled, but his eyes were still alert. Shoichi Yokoi realized how critical the moment was. Should he hide, as he had done for 27 years, or should he fight? His instincts kicked in, and he tried to run. However, after all those years, his body had become weak. Prolonged loneliness, inadequate nutrition, and his advancing age made him no longer as agile as before. The native hunters quickly realized that he wasn't a wild man. Though his clothes had become unrecognizable due to the wear of the years, they resembled the uniform of a Japanese soldier. This made them even more curious. Who was this man? Was he a Japanese soldier? But the war had ended years ago. Yokoi still believed the war was ongoing. For him, surrendering to the enemy was worse than death. That's why he tried to resist with all his strength. When the native hunters got closer, he took a defensive stance with a bamboo stick in his hand. The military training he had received in Japan taught him that he should resist under any circumstances. But he was exhausted. The hunters easily incapacitated him and brought him to the ground. The stunned locals tried to talk to him, but Yokoi didn't understand their language. When they spoke a few words in Japanese, Yokoi's eyes widened. For a man who had spent so many years alone, even hearing a human voice was a huge shock. However, in his mind, the war was still going on. Therefore, he remained quiet, trying to understand the enemy's plans. When the natives realized he was an old soldier from Japan, they were astounded. The fact that he had lived in the forest for 27 years was unbelievable. They quickly took him to the nearest settlement and informed the authorities. For the first time in years, Yokoi was being transported by vehicle, hearing the sounds of many people around him. Electric lights, buildings, modern clothes. All of these seemed like miracles to him. Believing that the war was still ongoing, Yokoi initially refused to accept the truth when questioned. He was shocked when he heard that Japan had surrendered. All these years he had been meticulously hiding from the enemy, yet the war had ended 27 years ago. After verifying his identity, the authorities confirmed that this man was indeed the Japanese soldier who had gone missing in 1944. His story quickly spread to the world press. People were amazed at how a person could survive in the forest for so many years. The discovery of Shoichi Yokoi was not just the finding of a lost soldier. It was also proof of human willpower, survival strength, and incredible discipline. However, for him this discovery would mean a great trauma after 27 years of solitude. Learning that the truth he had believed all these years was wrong would become an even heavier burden than the hardships he had lived through. Shoichi Yokoi's 27 years of solitude ended with his capture in Guam in 1972. However, for him, the real change began when he returned to Japan. The world had advanced while he was hiding in the forest, and Japan had undergone a major transformation. The country he had long dreamed of was now a completely different place, and he didn't know what awaited him there. When Yokoi was taken by plane from Guam to Japan, he was unaware of what awaited him. When he landed at the airport, he saw that thousands of people had gathered. The crowd greeted him with applause, taking photos and eagerly listening to his story. The Japanese press announced his return with headlines like, "The Last Samurai," "The Forgotten Soldier of the War." The Japanese people watched Yokoi with great admiration. He had survived alone for 27 years, shown loyalty to his emperor, and adhered to the rules of war. He was seen as one of the last soldiers of the war. However, despite all this attention, Yokoi was filled with inner turmoil. While everyone spoke of his courage and endurance, Shoichi Yokoi carried a deep sense of shame within him. The Japanese military training had taught him that it was more honorable to die in battle than to be captured. Yet he had neither died in the war nor given his last breath heroically in combat. Instead, he had hidden for 27 years. For him, it was a matter of honor. Upon learning of Japan's surrender, he began questioning his own situation as much as the disappointment he had felt. If Japan had surrendered in 1945, what was the point of his hiding all those years? Had he fought for his homeland only to realize it had all been in vain? Upon returning to his country, his words best summarize these feelings. "I'm happy to return to Japan after all these years, but I am filled with great shame." Yokoi was 26 years old when he left Japan. At the time, Japan was a nation recovering from the devastation of war, an imperialist and militaristic state. However, when he returned in 1972, he encountered a completely different country. Japan had experienced significant economic growth post-war, modernized, and become one of the largest industrial nations in the world. Neon lights illuminated the streets, skyscrapers rose high, and high-speed trains crisscrossed the country. People no longer lived under the shadow of war. They were part of a modern life. Technology had advanced rapidly, and social life had undergone major changes. Japan's new generation had not lived through the hardships of war and had grown up in a new culture. For Yokoi, however, this change was a shock. The Japan in his mind was still a nation carrying the nationalist and warrior spirit of the 1940s. But now, he was faced with a peaceful, industrialized Japan playing a significant role in the global economy. Shoichi Yokoi remained the center of public attention in Japan for a long time. He was invited to television programs, books were written about him, and interviews were held. People admired his survival techniques and showed great respect for him as an example of Japanese discipline and willpower. However, Yokoi did not want the attention to last for too long. He was not someone who enjoyed being in the spotlight. His 27 years in the forest had taught him the importance of a simple and modest life. Therefore, after a while, he withdrew from all this attention and chose a humble life. He married and settled in Nagoya. He led a small life and didn't participate much in public events. Other than giving a few lessons on survival, he largely lived in isolation from society. In the 1990s, he wrote a few books sharing his experiences, but he did so not for fame, but to leave a lesson for future generations. Shoichi Yokoi passed away in 1997 at the age of 82. Even after his death, his story continued to be told with great interest in Japan and around the world. He was not only a soldier but also one of the strongest examples of human will and survival instinct. His story highlighted the destructive effects of war on individuals. His 27-year struggle for survival made people rethink the concepts of war and peace. Shoichi Yokoi's life is a story not only of a battle that did not end with the conclusion of the war, but also of the great war a person faces against nature, time, and oneself.